Atalanta were your standard middle-of-the-road Serie A team. They were birthed under the titanic shadows of the nearby San Siro and the enormous teams housed within. But in 2016, Bergamo finally had a football team they could be proud of when Gian Piero Gasperini was appointed as Ledea's manager. Within 12 months, he had returned the club to Europe before a string of Champions League campaigns that were previously scarcely believable and were now the reality. Atalanta did it all by playing the most entertaining football in the entire continent and troubled even the loftier members of Italy's Big Six. But how did a team with just one Coppa Italia from the 1960s achieve all of this? Well, the following film reveals all. Bergamo is roughly an hour away from Milan, therefore the clubs in that bigger city have historically drained the chances of Atalanta. Stereotypically, Bergamo is a city known as the place of the hard worker, perhaps owing to the slew of construction companies housed in the city which helped rebuild the nearby Milan after the Second World War. At the start of the 20th century, Bergamo was a city more interested in gymnastics, fencing and wrestling. Yet, in 1907, 5 students founded Atalanta, named after they trawled through Greek mythology books and soon merged with FC Bergamo. 7 years later, they were given association status by the FIGC and were inaugurated with a 2-1 defeat to Inter in May 1914. World War I almost hampered the club as Atalanta had to sell their ground. After the war, however, they were granted the rights to a racecourse called the Clementina and were soon pulling in 10,000 fans for matches. The 1920s birthed an 18-team league, with 3 regions represented by 6 teams. Housed in Lombardy, there was room for just 1 team from Bergamo. A playoff to decide the Bergamo representative between Atalanta and Bergamasca was won by the former in their traditional black and white. Off the back of the result, the clubs agreed to merge and Atalanta finally adopted their black and blue from their Bergamaschi rivals. Their early days were pocked by the goal-scoring of Aldo Lazzaroni, Atalanta's first famous player. Then, as many in Italy were, Ledea felt the benefit of the Hungarian influx. Gideon Lucas and Jeno Hauser joined the club, whilst coach Imre Peja succeeded Atalanta's first professional coach, Cesare Lovati. Peja would lead Atalanta back into Serie A, where their stay in the top division was underlined by a mean defence. Key to this was Carlo Cerasoli, a member of Italy's 1938 World Cup winning squad. With Atalanta's return to Serie A in the 1940s came the opening of a soon-to-be legendary academy, thanks to Giuseppe Chiatto. In the senior setup, a band of legendary figures came through, the homegrown Severo Cominelli, Giovanni Gardone and Adriano Bassetto. Meanwhile, a Scandinavian influx that featured Hasse Jepsen, Carl Arge Hansen, Jorgen Leslie Sorensen, Bertil Nordahl and Paul Radmerson prevailed. In and amongst what is still an Atalanta record 15 consecutive seasons in the top flight, they'd achieve a first top 5 finish, a record which stood until the 2010s. And in spite of match-fixing scandals that ensured Ledea would be relegated under a cloud in 1958, Atalanta immediately returned and were shot into a golden age, and it's thanks in large part to Angelo Dominguini. The Bergamo-born player broke through in the 1960s. One of their most famous sons converged on a hat-trick in the Coppa Italia final of '63 alongside Dino da Costa and Flemming Nielsen. On the touchline, Pablo Tabanelli, but only because his predecessor Ferruccio Falcareggi was snapped up by Fiorentina after Atalanta's successful return to the top tier. Tabanelli can lay claim to being the only Atalanta manager to lift a piece of silverware. After his release that summer, the slide was immediate and almost inevitable, relegation confirmed after an elongated circling of the drain. The subsequent 1970s saw 40% of seasons end in either promotion or relegation. The turmoil was owed to the death of long-standing club president Daniele Turani. As a slew of managers were chewed up and spat out, so too were presidents in a chaotic decade where Atalanta almost suffered a stint in Serie A. In the haze of depression, one shining light. In 1976, the Zingonia Plant Academy was fully purchased by the club. Of course, Atalanta wouldn't be instantly furnished with world-class players as they suffered the seemingly inevitable season in the third tier of Italian football. Typically though, Atalanta would be housed in Serie A within 3 seasons and featured in a Coppa Italia final soon after against Diego Maradona and Napoli. Whatever the weather, Ledea were booked in for a return to Europe. It was immensely more successful than their 3-game stint in the 1963-64 Cup Winners' Cup, as Ledea fell at the first hurdle to eventual winners Sporting after a playoff was needed to split the pair. 24 years on as a Serie B team no less, Ledea reached the Final Four stage where they were undone by the surprise eventual winners Mechelen. Atalanta would return to Serie A and quickly enough to re-establish themselves with stars such as Claudio Caniggia and Eva, before qualifying for the UEFA Cup in successive seasons owing to top 7 finishes. They were quickly dumped out of the UEFA Cup in 1989 by Spartak Moscow in the first round, before being eliminated by compatriots Inter, the third time in 4 European campaigns that Ledea would be beaten by the eventual winner. The Zingonia Academy received a much-needed shot in the arm in 1991 when club president Antonio Percassi hired Stefano Bonaccorso to head up its revamp. Just when the spinning top of Atalanta looked set to finally calm, a revolving door of managers was enacted after Emiliano Mondonico's successful 4 years in the job. They returned to the Coppa Italia final for the 3rd time but were comprehensively beaten by Fiorentina, and this time didn't even have the consolation of a European run to look forward to. Not even a young Antonio Conte could make a name for himself in Bergamo as a manager, sacked quickly at the start of 2010, with the club firmly entrenched in a yo-yoing state. That summer, however, Antonio Percassi became the president again, and with the appointment of Stefano Colitano, Atalanta returned to the top flight for good in 2011. Whilst not as successful as previous Atalanta stints in Serie A, Ledea were comfortable in mid-table until 2015. Then Eddie Reha was appointed to steer the club away from relegation, achieving so in his first season by 3 points before a first full campaign crept Atalanta further into mid-table. Reha had improved Ledea a few points and places higher, but in the long term the club were still in the mire of looking over their shoulder at relegation. They were coasting, as they had done for almost all of their time in existence, save for a few brief moments in the 1960s and very early 90s. Officially, they can be called a provincial club that simply needs to be heavily reliant on their academy and needs to be shrewd in the transfer market as a result. Their greatest triumph, the 1963 Coppa Italia final, featured just 2 players born outside of the Lombardy region. Regardless, talent of any name value was used to being consigned out of the Atalanta door. Angelo Dominguini, Gaetano Scorea and Antonio Cabrini, all World Cup finalists in their own right, rapidly came to be snapped up by bigger teams. It continued through the 20th century to the quartet of Roberto Donadoni, Claudio Caniggia, Pippo Inzaghi and Christian Vieri. Whilst the Percassi family had delivered a much-needed stable footing in the top flight of the Italian game, their next appointment was crucial. Gian Piero Gasperini was born in 1958 and grew up a Juventus fan. He would subsequently graduate from the Juventus Academy, but after rare cup appearances, he departed. His middling midfield career would most notably take him to Palermo and Pescara in a pair of 5-year stints. At the latter is where Gasperini would finally set his feet on Serie A soil in 1987. From an early age, Gasperini was earmarked as a coach, and a year after his retirement in 1993, that prediction came true when he was appointed as a youth coach. This meant a return to Juventus, where a successful decade ended with Gasperini becoming disillusioned. He believed that senior coaching offered him a more effective way of shaping the players of tomorrow. Therefore, he wound up at Serie C side Crotone. At the third-tier club, Gasperini carved himself out a tiny Juventus academy enclave and proved that the kids were alright in earning promotion at the first time of asking. After Crotone had erroneously sacked him following a poor start to life in Serie B, he returned months later before jumping ship to Genoa. Here would be Gasperini's best moments as a manager before Bergamo. He returned Genoa to Serie A, and armed with the goal-scoring machine of Diego Milito and midfield might of Thiago Motta, Il Grifone finished 5th and earned plaudits from the lofty environs of Jose Mourinho and Sir Alex Ferguson. Milito's goals earned him a late career dream move to Inter, where he won the Champions League. It earned tactically innovative Gasperini the sack. The following season he followed Milito to the San Siro but faced stern opposition in his quirky 3-4-3 that had previously upset the Serie A apple cart. Being Inter's 5th choice as manager wasn't the best start, and Gasperini was sacked after no wins from his first 5 games. Palermo proved an exercise in jumping from frying pan directly into the fire, as a stereotypically mad house of revolving management stuck true to its word. Gasperini would last 23 matches across 2 stints, no less. His reputation was in tatters, so he returned to the comfort of Genoa. 3 years had passed and so much water had flown under the bridge, yet Gasperini worked his magic once again. Genoa returned to the top 6 once more, which ensures that Gasperini accounts for 66% of the club's top 6 finishes since the Second World War. Still, this is Italian football, so the man who delivered Genoa such glories was sacked the following season after a middling start. In the summer of 2016, Gasperini needed to prove himself. He had to do so away from the comforts of Genoa, away from the madcap owners at clubs like Palermo, and now clubs as lofty as the country's Big Six wouldn't touch him. Gasperini wanted to remain embedded to his ideals, but first, the absolute hurricane of mess that awaited him in Bergamo needed to be sorted out. At Atalanta, Gasperini met the second oldest Serie A squad on average at 28.1 years of age. Instantly, he set about cutting 741 games worth of footballers from the squad, with 34-year-old Herman Dennis, a 36-year-old record appearance maker Gianpaolo Bellini departing, as well as Maxi Morales. Martin de Roon was a player he didn't wish to leave, yet the Dutchman was swayed by the allure of the Premier League and Middlesbrough. In response, Gasperini took to the loan market to bring in young fullback Leonardo Spinazzola from Juventus and a much-needed number 1 from Lazio, Inetrit Beresha. Then the change in styles up front with the acquisitions of Andrea Petagna and Alberto Polosci for more presence in attack. The outlier in Gasperini's transfer market spending was Abdoulaye Konko, the 32-year-old whom the manager had worked with at Genoa. Out of the players Gasperini inherited, the young or unfavoured trio of Andrea Conte, Roberto Gagliardini and Remo Freuler were given more of a chance. Meanwhile, Frank Kessié and Matteo Caldara weren't shipped out on another loan and instead brought into the senior squad. Between the 5, they had played a combined 22 games for the club. Whilst Alessandro Bastoni was promoted from the academy come the autumn, Gasperini built his team around playmaker Papu Gomez. The Argentine had previously shone at Catania, and a mistimed move saw his career diverted to Metalist Kharkiv. In his 2 years in Bergamo since returning to Italy, Gomez had been misused as a left winger in a 4-4-2 formation. Whilst Gomez would be deployed nominally from the left, it would categorically not be as a winger. Rafael Toloi, Andrea Masiello and Ervin Zekanovic made up a central trio of defenders who were adept with the ball at their feet and aggressive out of possession. Toloi, previously a right-back, was the perfect fit for Gasperini for what he wished his wide centre-backs to be. Meanwhile, Boukari Dramé was allowed to steam up and down the left from his wing-back berth, safe in the knowledge that Yasmin Kurtic, or the aforementioned likes of Freuler, Kessié or Gagliardini, would either cover for him or join him in the attack. The results at the start of the season, at least, were a mess, with the defence all over the place. They shipped 11 goals, earning just 3 points from their first 5 matches. Instantly, Gasperini's mind returned to the San Siro, where a similarly chaotic start cost him the job. The turning point for Gasperini at Atalanta, however, lay in a September 2016 defeat at home to Palermo. It served to illuminate the differences between the trigger-happy institutions of Italian football and the more patient, sensible clubs. Instead of wielding the axe, Antonio Percassi read the players the riot act before going at lengths to call Gasperini untouchable as the Atalanta manager. It lit the fire in each and every one of the Atalanta players. It didn't do any harm that Gasperini was entrusted with Atalanta's academy, as well as playing his style of the 3-4-1-2. He wanted his teams to play with an extreme width that saw interchangeable diamonds with wing-backs, outer centre-half, central midfielders and strikers converging close to the touchline. Meanwhile, the centre of the pitch would be the occupation of the central defender, maintaining an aggressively high line, and the playmaker Papu Gomez, who stuck close by to the referee for space. Once in the final third, nothing was off limits. The wing-back or centre-half could invert, the striker could cover for them, the play could be gifted to the influential Papu Gomez centrally to find a target, or play could be switched to the overload on the corresponding flank. With complete interchanging of positions, the opposition found themselves hampered and weary of the transition. This was the modern take on total football, and Atalanta totally had Italian football in the palm of their hands. Frank Kessier's deployment further up front in midfield suited him perfectly. Caldara found a bizarre knack for goal, so too Andrea Conti, often ghosting in from the right, and Andrea Petagna proved the perfect foil for Papu Gomez. The interchangeability didn't mean man-to-man marking was off the table, however. The result was Atalanta surging up the table. They went unbeaten for 3 months, with the highlight being a stunning 1-0 victory over Maurizio Sarri's Napoli, the previous golden boy for football in hipsters. On a personal level, victories over Inter in January and October would have tasted sweet for Gasperini, and by December, they were entrenched within the top 6. It even captured the attention of the national team as Papu Gomez received his first call-up. Only this was for the Italian national team, and while Gomez did hold Italian citizenship, he waited out for his native Argentina to come calling. In May 2017, they did. The run had to end at some point, and against Juventus, winner of the previous 5 Serie A titles, an understandable climax. Regardless, the 53 points that Atalanta picked up in 2016 was their best return in club history. The reopening of the transfer window in January 2017 prompted a major upheaval of a type that Atalanta and Gasperini would have to come used to. Roberto Gagliardini was loaned to Inter with an obligation to buy, whilst Matteo Caldara was signed by Juventus, only to be thankfully loaned back. In their places, Gasperini already moved on. Gianluca Mancini arrived from Perugia and Brian Cristante from Benfica. Meanwhile, Hans Hatterborg provided competition for Conte at right wing-back, and Pierluigi Gallini was signed as a young understudy in goal. Debuts were handed out for Alessandro Bastoni and Filippo Melingone to prove the Atalanta Academy production line could keep churning. Before Atalanta returned to even greater prominence in the second half of the season, almost entirely at the hands of Papu Gomez. The diminutive Argentine was instrumental in another 2-month unbeaten run, whilst Caldara and Conte found their shooting boots from defence, scoring a combined 15 goals. The midfield was no exception, as 18 goals were harvested from the trio of Freuler, Kessier and Kurtic. Again though, the run came to an understandable end away at the San Siro to Inter, even if it was somewhat of an anomaly. It proved Ledea's final defeat of the season, shipping 7 from just 12 shots. Whilst Atalanta would draw a few too many games to conclude the season, their rivals for European football in Milan couldn't buy victories. Consequently, as Atalanta took a point of each of Milan, Juventus and Roma, Inter couldn't stop losing and Milan couldn't buy a win. Hence, with 2 games to go, Atalanta needed just 1 more point to return to the European stage for the first time in a generation. With a trip to Empoli and a home tie to end on against Chievo, Atalanta took all the spoils as Papu Gomez scored both of Ledea's goals in a pair of 1-0 triumphs. They not only pipped Milan to 5th, but thanks to Lazio's capitulation on the final day against Crotone, Atalanta conspired to finish within the top 4. The most perfect of foundations were laid. Until the transfer window ripped them out and forced Gasperini to relay them. A hole was left down the right-hand side thanks to the €24 million sale of Andrea Conti to Milan. In response, Robin Gosens from Heracles and Timothy Castagna from Genk shored up both sides. The Conti deal brought Matteo Pessina to the club in a player plus cash arrangement. Just as well, since Milan had acquired Franck Kessié for a staggering €28 million. The proceeds of the club's biggest sale of the summer saw to Martin de Roon's return from England after Middlesbrough were relegated. Alessandro Bastoni's time in Bergamo neared its end, but he would be loaned back after completing a deal to Inter, whilst Irvin Zukanovic's loan deal ended. Nonetheless, the astute €4 million acquisition of Jose Luis Palomino from Ludogorets maintained the depth at centre-half. What would prove to be the icing on the cake was Josip Ilicic's €5 million transfer from Fiorentina to shoulder some of the creative burden going forward. Perhaps the biggest transfer in the long run was the purchase of their stadium, which eased development plans. In the meantime, however, Atalanta's Europa League contest would be played at Sassuolo. In the preview for the season, The Guardian predicted an Atalanta struggle, particularly after losing nearly €60 million worth of players. They would start in that manner, losing the big fixtures against Roma and Napoli that they would prevail in under Gasperini the prior season. Robin Gosens and Hans Hatterborg were hampered out wide due to a lack of continuity at centre-half. The problems in defence ceiled Ledea to mid-table, as they were made to wait for a first win on their travels until December against Genoa. Such luminaries as Sassuolo, Crotone, Bologna, Hellas Verona and Benevento were the only clubs beaten at home prior to the festive period. Meanwhile, it proved a different story in the Europa League. With clubs less attuned to Atalanta's methods in Lyon and Everton, Ledea massacred the Toffees 8-1 over 2 games before taking 4 points from Lyon to top the group. One rare early season highlight was a Matteo Caldara-sparked comeback against Juventus, dredging a 2-goal deficit into parity. Finally, Josip Ilicic kicked into gear, with the midfield partnership of De Roon and Freuler flourishing. The 2017-18 season's breakout star, though, was Brian Cristante, who continuously chipped in with goals. Milan and Roma were beaten away. Hellas Verona eviscerated 5-0 away in Verona, as the resurgent league form was paired with cruel exits in cup competition. Atalanta were just 7 minutes from progression against Borussia Dortmund in the Europa League's last 32, before Juventus picked off Ledea 1-0 in each leg of the Coppa Italia semi-final. They would qualify for the Europa League's qualifying rounds in 7th via Andrea Masiello's stoppage-time equaliser at home to Milan. This was also thanks in part to Moussa Barrow, an academy graduate who prospered in the final furlong of the season, as he netted against Benevento, Genoa and Lazio. Atalanta regressed 3 places and 12 points, with the Europa League distractions almost solely to blame. They not have such an excuse the following year. The Europa was put to bed before the end of August after penalty defeat to Copenhagen. It stung at the time, but it might have proved a blessing in disguise. However, it took time for Atalanta to recalibrate, as they rebounded from winning the first game by failing to win again until October the 21st. Ledea started the season with an 8th of the wage bill that champions Juventus could boast, and spent the 14th most out of all Serie A clubs in approach to the 2018-19 season. This in spite of retooling the entire midfield and attack. Brian Cristante was this summer's big sale, typically departing for one of Italy's big six, whilst Mario Pasalic was acquired on a long-term loan deal from Chelsea for cover. The attack saw the target men of old in Andrea Petagna and Andreas Cornelius shipped off to Spal and Bordeaux respectively. In response, Sampdoria's Duvan Zapata was delivered to bring a more direct goal threat. Berat Jim City's return after 2 years on loan felt like a new signing, and he would prolifically add to his previous 3 appearances for the club. A player who would perpetually remain on 3 Atalanta appearances was Dejan Kulusevski, the latest jewel in the academy crown, and his performances on loan at Parma would eventually seal transfers to the likes of Juventus and Tottenham Hotspur. Atalanta were developing the tags of entertainers, if not for their eviscerations of teams scoring by the bucket load, then their wildly entertaining tussles. Take Roma for example. Matches between Ledea and the Giallo Rossi in the 2018-19 season saw 2 3-3 draws. The first where Roma were 3-1 down and levelled, the second where Atalanta came from 3 down to draw. This run of excitement only came, however, with 3 matches without scoring that straddled September and October fixtures against Torino, Fiorentina and Sampdoria. 3 against Parma, Udinese, Fiorentina, 4 flew in against Inter and Bologna, 5 in for Rosinone and 6 away at Sassuolo. 77 goals were scored, even more than Juventus, who ran away with the league on 90 points. Gian Piero Gasperini had changed tact. Pierluigi Gollini was now in goal. The aggressive wider centre-halves of Rafael Toloi and Gianluca Mancini flung themselves forward, with Berat Jim City maintaining a high line behind them. Hans Atebor and Robin Gersons at wing-back, whilst Martin de Roon and Remo Freuler in the middle of the park were now established partnerships. Josip Ilicic and Papu Gomez previously leading the line, yet with the goals drying up, Duvan Zapata's 28-goal haul allowed the pair more creativity, whilst the Colombian fired in the goals. As nerves were shredded ahead of a potential Champions League qualification, Atalanta somehow contrived not to score from 47 shots against Empoli. The 0-0 draw crumpled Atalanta down to 6th on April the 15th with 6 matches left to play. Yet they bounced back, overturning a deficit against Napoli, confirming their spot in the Coppa Italia final ahead of Fiorentina, before returning to the top 4 after a victory at home to Udinese was coupled with a Milan defeat against Torino. The next enormous Serie A clash pitted Atalanta with Lazio at the Olimpico. Again they would have to come from behind, and did so via Duvan Zapata, Timothy Castagna and an own goal. It opened the gap to 5th place Roma to just 3 points. The courage of their football and their attacking nature drew comparisons to Ajax from a certain Fabio Capello. Unfortunately, 10 days later, in the same stadium no less, Atalanta were unable to beat the same opposition as Joaquin Correa settled a nervy Coppa Italia final. Ledea waited on for their second piece of silverware. They wouldn't have to wait long for the sound of the Champions League anthem in their ears, however. 14 days later was their confirmation day. They had earned a point in Turin against Juventus, which left them in 3rd place ahead of the final weekend, yet nothing was sealed. Inter were behind them only on head-to-head, whilst Milan prayed for either team to slip up. Atalanta went first, conceding via Sassuolo's Domenico Berardi as Inter remained level, and Frank Kessié of all players sent Milan into what would be an unassailable lead over Spal. Then Berardi was shown a straight red on the stroke of half-time. At the half-time break, with both Milan sides winning, Atalanta were returning to the Europa League. Then the 10 men buckled. Papu Gomez and Mario Pasalic got the goals that sent Ledea surging up the table from 5th to 3rd. They had secured their highest ever finish, and they were finally due to meet with the Champions League. Gasperini was now an honorary citizen of Bergamo. Now the task was to keep him in Bergamo. There were no big departures from the playing staff for the first summer window in recent memory, and that extended to the manager. This despite Roma and Inter openly on the prowl after sacking the likes of Eusebio Di Francesco and Luciano Spalletti, respectively. Furthermore, Atalanta went out and spent some serious money, for them at least. Luis Muriel added strength up front from Sevilla for €15 million, whilst Ruslan Malinovsky was another acquisition for the front line from Genk at €13 million. Whilst it felt like an all-too-rare net spend splurge in the market, Atalanta had received a big wedge of cash from the obligation to buy loans in 2016, largely from the sale of Frank Kessié to Milan. A drawback in their sudden success was the need to develop the Gewiss Stadium, which could not be used for the UEFA Champions League, and nor could Atalanta use it for their two quote-unquote home games. A loss to Torino and a draw to Fiorentina represented a tepid start, but once Ledea could play in Bergamo, their league form planted them in the top three. From big victories away to Roma at Sassuolo and a chaotic 3-3 draw at the Olimpico against Lazio, to the big haul in front of goal against Udinese, Atalanta had hit the ground running. So too had Luis Muriel. On the other side of the coin, the Champions League was a disaster. They were picked off again and again by Dinamo Zagreb as Mislav Orsic netted a hat-trick in a damning indictment of a 4-0 defeat in Croatia. Another loss against the run of play and late on too in the San Siro against Shakhtar Donetsk went to prove Atalanta's inexperience. Before the campaign, only Duvan Zapata and Mario Pasalic had competed in the Champions League, and with a Manchester City doubleheader to come, Gasperini's side were on the ropes. They were struck for 5 against Pep Guardiola's side in Manchester before their first point came in front of just 34,000 in a barely half-full San Siro. Regardless, the manager of the English champions likened playing Atalanta to a trip to the dentist. Atalanta now had to go where only one other Champions League team had gone, qualify from a group stage after losing their first 3 matches. And even Newcastle United, the prior team to have done so in 2002, had won their 4th game. Atalanta were just thankful that a winner couldn't be found from either Dinamo Zagreb versus Shakhtar Donetsk game. Therefore, the task was relatively simple. Victories at the San Siro against Dynamo and away in Ukraine against Shakhtar would likely see them through. Luis Muriel and Papu Gomez combined to devastating effect at home to the Croatians before a wonderful second-half display in Ukraine completed Atalanta's side of the bargain. Thankfully for Gasperini, Guardiola had upheld his side too, Gabriel Jesus netting a hat-trick in a Croatian victory to confirm Atalanta's qualification for the last 16. If Atalanta were guilty of falling to sickening losses of points later on in the first half of the season, then they kicked into a higher gear once the Champions League was put to bed for a couple of months. Rafael Toloi had made a timely return to form, whilst Robin Gosens looked imperious across all parts of the pitch, from defence and build-up to nearly slotting in double figures in front of goal. Behind them, Jose Luis Palomino was now trusted in the one central defensive role and curtailed the calls for pragmatism in the autumn. Key to this was consecutive 5-0 triumphs over Milan and Parma either side of the new year that had Gasperini dancing with glee on the touchline. The unbeaten run took in 2 rampant victories over Torino and Lecce, where they hit a combined 14 goals in 2 games. Then the world stopped. Atalanta most keenly felt the tragedy of the coronavirus pandemic on their own doorstep, with 6,000 deaths in the first few months. Yet nobody was to know this when they eviscerated Valencia 4-1 at the San Siro in the Champions League's last 16 first leg. By the time the pair met 3 weeks later, the world had changed. 2,500 people from Valencia turned up in Milan for the first leg, a match alongside Atletico Madrid's trip to Anfield, later referred to as a biological bomb, as England, Spain and Italy became the European hotspots for COVID in the pandemic's first months. The second leg was played before complete shutdown of football, but it would be sensibly conducted behind closed doors. A shame, as Josip Ilicic put in his great performance, scoring 4 in an eventual 8-4 aggregate triumph over the former 2-time finalists. It felt fitting for the suddenly fashionable underdogs that their charge continentally and domestically was formed by two outsiders. Ilicic, a man who had shot to stardom but feared for his career when diagnosed with lymphadenitis, recovered though to play an immense part. Then to Papu Gomez, the trequartista who many thought never would ascend to his potential and was now making the most exciting team in football tick. Both were doing so at the age of 32. The victory in Valencia proved Atalanta's last for 3 months, yet once professional football was allowed to resume in the summer of 2020, they simply picked up as if nothing had happened. Atalanta tended to grow into a season under Gasperini, yet with so much hardship taking place around them, an added impetus was added to Ladea's play. Aided by the new 5 substitutions rule, Gasperini was now allowed all kinds of joy and combinations in attack, with each one of Zapata, Gomez, Muriel, Malinovsky, Ilicic, Pasalic and academy graduate Amad Diallo now able to be used in a single game. Sassuolo were thumped again, Brescia smashed for 6 in the derby, Lazio and Udinese edged out in entertaining 3-2 wins whilst Napoli were handled yet again. The measure of how far Atalanta had come was truly on July the 11th, 2020. A trip to Turin and a victory against Juventus would have blown the title race wide open. And they should have won too. 2 Cristiano Ronaldo penalties dragged Atalanta back level twice. Had they won that match, they could have won the league. Instead, the draws that were interlaced with fine attacking displays sealing Atalanta to 3rd place. They finished 2 short of a century of goals, 15 more than champions Juventus, and the most in Serie A since each of Juve, Milan and Inter clocked up over 100 in the 1950-51 campaign. But the season wasn't over just yet. The Champions League finals tournament in Lisbon took precedent in August. Paris Saint-Germain and a half-fit Kylian Mbappe with a potential semi-final between one of Leipzig or Atletico Madrid was a very feasible route to a seemingly impossible final. They deserved to be in front when Mario Pasalic curled one wonderfully beyond Keylor Navas. However, once Kylian Mbappe was summoned for a cameo from the bench, the Parisians grew into the game and provided 2 sucker punches in second-half stoppage time, first from Marquinhos and then from Eric Maxim Choupo-Moting. They were afforded little to no rest. Atalanta's 2020-21 campaign kicked off a mere 44 days after their previous season had concluded. Whilst they suffered the sale of Timothy Castagne to Leicester City, they would be reimbursed with another signing from Genk in Joachim Mæhle the following January. In the meantime, Alexei Miranchuk and Sam Lammers came to add yet another dimension up front, whilst Christian Romero seamlessly slotted into defence. There was no slowing Atalanta's strike rate, as Luis Muriel's impact from the bench was immense. The Colombian would score or assist every 58 minutes between 2019 and 2021, making him the most prolific professional footballer on the planet. Also, performances like Josip Ilicic's hat-trick against Milan won matches on their own. Torino, Lazio, Roma and Benevento were struck for 4-5 of the best against both Cagliari and Sassuolo. However, they placed 7th by January, an indifferent campaign under Gasperini as questions started to be asked of him. This was purely a byproduct of the new expectations as a Champions League faring team. And speaking of Europe, Atalanta were finally allowed to play home games in Bergamo. Yet this was of course due to the 2020-21 season being played behind closed doors. Their Champions League matches with Ajax warmed Europe in the winter as the former 4-time champions found themselves outplayed and effectively eliminated by Atalanta, who took 4 points from the Dutch team. By the time the Champions League returned in February, with Ladea penciled in for a blockbuster tie with Real Madrid, Atalanta's world was turned upside down. Papu Gomez had left, sold to Sevilla in the January window. The talisman began to be omitted from squads in December, first coming against Udinese, which was practically unheard of as he had usually played 90% of the minutes under Gasperini and was a key conspirator in attack. The Argentine returned for stints against both Ajax and Juventus, but his last act would be against the latter in a 1-1 draw. After being left out, Gomez felt aggrieved and asked the president for an apology from Gasperini, which never arrived. The only saving grace for Gasperini was that his team were well stocked in his position. The captaincy was to be assumed by Rafael Toloi, and the satellites of number 10s continued Gomez's good work. Real Madrid, however, proved a step too far in the last 16 of the Champions League. They likely would have done with or without Papu Gomez, as Atalanta fell 1-0 in Bergamo, hindered massively by a Remo Freuler red card 17 minutes in. Goals either side of the half-time break back in Madrid's Academy Stadium in the second leg from world-class talent in Karim Benzema and Sergio Ramos proved the end and qualified the 13-time champions instead. In a time of hardship, Atalanta were not only flying the flag for Bergamo but for Italy in the Champions League. They had been the last remaining Serie A team in the competition the year prior, and only because of fixture scheduling were they beaten to that accolade in 2021, as both Lazio and Juventus joined Atalanta in last 16 elimination. Atalanta had lost their talisman. They had lost Champions League football, but as the 2020-21 season drew to its conclusion, they had lost none of their momentum. Gasperini failed to make too many concessions to his footballing philosophy, and once again he benefited from a second half of the season uptick in form. Once again, the likes of Napoli and Genoa felt the wrath of Atalanta, conceding 4 at their hands, whilst Crotone, Bologna and Parma all suffered worse fates as Ledea re-ensconced themselves into the Champions League picture. Whilst Juventus were no longer the all-conquering dynastic team of old who won Serie A, a 1-0 victory over Andrea Pirlo's team was to be celebrated after a deflected Ruslan Malinovsky strike. The Ukrainian, alongside Muriel, Gersons and Zapata, had firmly stepped in to fill the void, and his goal proved the difference between 3rd and 4th. It meant Champions League football for the 3rd season running. In the same time frame, only Inter and Juve could boast the same record in Italy. Yet the season wasn't over. After picking up 4 points against Juventus in the league campaign, Atalanta faced the same opponents in the Coppa Italia final. Cristiano Ronaldo was out injured, Andrea Pirlo was on the verge of being sacked, and Juventus had finished behind Atalanta. In short, they were there to be beaten. Unfortunately, the old lady would have the last laugh as former Atalanta Academy product Dejan Kulusevski netted in the final as Juventus won 2-1. The continued near misses in the League, Cup and even on the continent had to be disappointing, but it's worth a constant reminder that Atalanta, by any available metric, should have been treading water as a mid-table Serie A team. In the second half of the season, Atalanta had only lost to Juventus, Inter, Milan and Real Madrid, 4 of the biggest pillars in European football, and they were the only reason why they remained trophyless. Whilst freakish weather forced the postponement of an all-or-nothing Champions League group fixture with Villarreal and concluded in Atalanta's demotion to the Europa League, it was still impressive at all that they reached the final 8 of that competition. The 2021-22 season would conclude with Atalanta finishing outside the European places for the first time under Gasperini. Attributed to this disappointment was the long injury layoffs to crucial players like Robin Gersons. Still, it had become ingrained in Atalanta's DNA to bounce back from such disappointments, even if their constantly low wage bill demanded that they should be in the bottom half. In 2023, they quickly returned to Europe, finishing 5th. Whilst Gasperini has adapted to a change in Serie A as the roll call of winners has become more diverse and shunned away from Turin and to Milan and Naples, Atalanta's squad has gotten even younger. They now don't press as high, they're less susceptible to the counter and now only record goal tallies in Serie A of 65 and 66. Only Inter, Napoli, Lazio and Milan can boast a higher record over the past 2 seasons in Italy. The player turnover will always continue, as the players of Rasmus Højlund, Mary Demiral and Jeremy Boga have been flipped inside of 2 years or less. The club maintains a competitive edge, and this is despite losing Musa Barrow, Christian Romero, Robin Gersons, Pierluigi Gallini, Remo Freuler, Ruslan Malinovsky, Josip Ilicic, Matteo Pessina, Joachim Meiler and Duvan Zapata over the past 2 seasons. Everything points to Atalanta's demise around the corner, their low age profile and wage bill, yet it never arrives. Gasperini has imparted an incredibly fluid and attacking tactic on the hundreds of players he has coached in Bergamo. He has been the difference. He turned a team scrabbling around in Serie A's mid-table averaging just over a goal a game to a team 3 minutes away from a Champions League semi-final, almost doubling their goal return in the process as they have been embroiled in Coppa Italia finals and Serie A title races. They have never failed to finish in the top 8 in 7 successive seasons under Gasperini. To put into perspective the job the manager has done, only these teams are the others from the top 5 European leagues who have matched that achievement. By all metric, Atalanta are minuscule in comparison, and that is where the true beauty of this goddess lies.